I was 58 when I finally decided to stay at that old cabin in Pine Hollow. It was a place I hadn't seen in almost 20 years. I used to go there when I was younger, back when I worked as a field technician for a power company. The cabin had been built by one of the old linemen back in the 1960s, and after he passed, nobody claimed it. It stood there, half hidden between thick pine trees and brush, about 3 miles off the main road. I always remembered it as quiet, a little crooked, but solid. I thought it would be a good spot to be alone for a while. It was early October 2017. The air had already started to turn cold. The trees were losing their color, and at night the woods went so quiet it felt like the air was holding its breath. I'd been dealing with too much noise and stress in town. Neighbors, traffic, everything. So I packed my pickup with enough food for a week, a small generator, and some old tools I thought might come in handy. My plan was simple. Spend a few quiet days fixing up the cabin, maybe write down some thoughts, maybe just sit and listen to nothing for a change. The first time I saw the cabin again, I almost turned around. The roof had sagged in the middle, the windows were dusted over with dirt, and weeds had grown high against the walls. A rusted wheelbarrow leaned against the porch. It looked like no one had stepped there in years. The front steps creaked like bones when I climbed them. The door was swollen from rain, but it opened with a slow, long groan. The smell hit me first: damp wood, mold, old smoke. I could almost smell the years that had passed since I last stood there. Inside, it was darker than I expected. The windows let in only a dull light through the grime. The furniture was all still there. A table, 2 chairs, a small cot, a wood stove. But everything was covered in a thin layer of dust and pine needles that had drifted in through the cracks. A single old photograph hung crooked on the wall. Some man standing next to a power line truck, smiling. I figured it was the original owner. I spent that first day cleaning. I swept out leaves, scrubbed the counter, aired the place out. I cut firewood from a fallen pine nearby and stacked it by the stove. By sunset, the cabin almost looked alive again. The kind of place where someone might have lived once. Maybe a quiet man who didn't need much. That night, the wind picked up, came down the valley hard, shaking the walls. I could hear branches scraping the roof, tapping and dragging. Every now and then, a loose shutter slapped against the siding. I tried to sleep on the cot, but the mattress was old and smelled faintly of mildew. I turned over again and again, listening to the sound of the woods pressing against the cabin. Then I heard it, a sharp sound, like something snapping outside. Maybe a stick, maybe something heavier. I told myself it was probably an animal. There were deer, raccoons, maybe even a black bear that wandered this far down. But as I lay there, I could tell the sound wasn't random. It came in short bursts, crunching leaves, stopping, then crunching again. Slow, careful, like footsteps trying not to be heard. I stayed still and listened. The noise moved closer to the cabin, then stopped completely. For a long minute, there was nothing, just the wind pushing against the walls. I thought maybe it was just my mind playing tricks, the kind of thing that happens when you spend too much time alone in the dark. I eventually drifted off, though the rest of my sleep was thin and restless. The next morning, I walked around outside to see if there were tracks. The ground was soft from rain, and sure enough, I found prints near the edge of the porch. Not animal tracks, but boots. The kind with a flat heel and a tread pattern. They led up from the tree line and then back again, as if someone had come close and then changed their mind. They weren't mine. My boots had a thick rubber sole with a round heel, and these were sharper, more narrow. I stood there for a while, looking at the tracks. My first thought was that maybe a hunter or a hiker had come by. But the prints came from a direction where no trail ran. It was just dense woods out that way. I tried not to overthink it. Still, the idea of someone walking around out there without me noticing made me uneasy. I started locking the cabin door after that, even though it barely had a latch. I spent the next 2 days cutting more wood and clearing the small path that led down to the creek. The more time I spent out there, the more I started to notice how empty the woods felt. No birds, no sound except for the wind and the occasional creak of trees. Even the air felt heavy, like the forest was holding something back. I tried keeping myself busy, fixing a broken window hinge, sealing the gaps in the door, but every now and then I caught myself staring out at the tree line, waiting for movement. The third night was worse. The generator had run out of gas around midnight, so the cabin went completely dark. I used my flashlight for a while, then switched it off to save battery. That's when I heard something, a dragging sound on the porch. Not fast, not loud, just a slow scrape, like someone pulling something heavy. Then it stopped. I could hear breathing, not close but not far either, just outside the door. I didn't move. I just lay there listening. My own heartbeat felt louder than anything else. After a minute or so, the sound faded away. I didn't go outside until morning. When I did, I saw marks on the wooden porch boards. Long scratches, uneven, like something had been dragged. There were more boot prints too, fresher this time, leading back into the trees. I started to think about leaving, but part of me didn't want to give in to fear. I told myself maybe someone had been using the place before me, maybe a squatter or a hunter storing equipment. Maybe they didn't like finding me there. It made sense, kind of. That afternoon, I walked deeper into the woods to see if I could find where the prints led. I followed them for nearly half a mile until I came across an old tent half buried under leaves. The canvas was torn, the inside soaked through. A sleeping bag was rolled up inside, but it was damp and smelled like rot. I found a small metal box near it, rusted shut. When I pried it open, there were a few shotgun shells inside, all green with corrosion. No gun though. I left everything as it was and walked back fast. The air felt wrong back there, too still. That evening, I packed most of my things. I decided I'd leave at first light. I sat up for a long time that night, listening to the stove crackle and pop. Around 2 in the morning, the noise came again. Not footsteps this time, but something hitting the side of the cabin. A dull thud, then another, then another. It came from different spots each time, like someone circling the walls. I didn't move. I just held my flashlight and waited. The noise went on for what felt like an hour, then stopped. I didn't sleep after that. At dawn, I loaded my truck fast and was ready to leave when I noticed something that made my chest tighten. The back of the cabin, near the woodpile, had deep gouges in the wall. Not like from an animal, they were made by a blade, clean and sharp. And carved into the wood were 3 words, "Stay out here." That was enough. I drove off without looking back, bumping hard over the dirt road until I hit the main highway. I didn't stop until I was miles away. A week later, curiosity got the better of me. I called the local sheriff's office in Brainerd County to report what I'd found. The tent, the tracks, the carvings. The deputy told me something that stayed with me since. He said a man had gone missing in those woods about 6 years before, a hunter from another town. They found his truck but never found him. The last place his phone had pinged was near Pine Hollow. I didn't go back to the cabin again. I sold the land to a timber company a few months later. Sometimes, though, I still wake up at night and think about those sounds on the porch. Slow footsteps, dragging across the wood, pausing just outside the door like they were waiting to see if I'd open it. And every time the wind rattles my windows at home, I still half expect to hear that scraping sound start up again. It was the middle of October, 1996, somewhere deep in the northern part of Oregon. I was 34 that year, and I remember that week clearly because the rain never seemed to stop. I'd taken some time off from my job in Portland, packed up a few tools, and driven out to a small plot of land I owned near a forested hillside. My plan was simple: build a small cabin with my own hands, something quiet and away from everything. I wanted to work alone, clear my head, and see what I could make of the place. The drive there took longer than usual because the dirt road had turned into a muddy mess from days of rainfall. The trees leaned over the road like they were trying to block the way, their wet branches brushing against my truck as I crawled forward. When I finally got to the clearing, the rain had started to come down harder. The land wasn't much, just a small patch of uneven ground surrounded by dense pine and cedar trees. The smell of wet earth and rotting leaves filled the air. I could hear the rain hitting the hood of the truck like small stones, and the sound didn't stop for a second. I parked close to where I wanted to build and unloaded the tools: an old saw, a hammer, some nails, and a tarp to keep things dry. I had a few wooden planks I'd brought from home and planned to cut more from nearby fallen trees. It was already late afternoon, and the light had that dull gray tone that happens right before it gets dark, even though it was only around 4. I figured I'd at least get the foundation started before the weather got any worse. The ground was soft, and every step I took made a sucking sound as mud pulled at my boots. My hands were cold even with gloves, and the rain soaked through my jacket. The first few hours were slow. I set up a small tarp between 2 trees so I could work under it, but the wind kept pushing the rain sideways. I could hear it rattling the plastic like someone shaking it. Every few minutes, the forest around me would groan from the wind, branches snapping somewhere far off. It felt like the kind of night where everything wanted to fall apart. By the time I had a few beams in the ground, it was nearly dark. The rain turned from steady to heavy, thick drops that made small craters in the mud. My flashlight's beam looked weak against it. The forest had gone almost black except for the little bit of light from the tarp area. I could see my breath in front of me, which was strange for October. It was colder than I expected. I decided to make a small fire under a metal sheet I had brought. The smoke barely rose before the wind pushed it sideways, but it gave me a bit of light and heat. I worked for another hour, sawing and nailing the wooden frame together. The noise echoed weirdly through the trees, coming back faintly like someone else was doing the same thing deeper in the forest. At one point, I stopped and listened. There was just the rain and the steady dripping off the branches, but something about the quiet that followed made me uneasy. It felt like the forest was watching me, though I knew it was just the sound of rain and darkness playing tricks on my nerves. I shook it off and kept building. When I stopped to rest, I sat on a piece of wood near the fire and just listened to the night. The rain had eased for a while, falling softer now, but everything was soaked. My clothes stuck to me, and I could feel water seeping into my boots. The smell of wet wood smoke mixed with the damp air. Somewhere far off, I heard a faint thud, like something heavy hitting the ground. Maybe a tree branch had fallen. I told myself that and went back to work. Around 9, I decided to start putting up the roof frame, just enough so I could sleep inside it later. I planned to stay out there overnight instead of driving back. The road would be too muddy anyway. I had a small sleeping bag, a lantern, and a bit of food. I told myself it'd be fine, just one night. The wind started picking up again, though stronger this time. The trees swayed, and the tarp above me snapped so loudly that it made me jump. I turned off the lantern to save power and sat still for a while, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness. That's when I noticed something. Faint lights, or what I thought were lights, deeper in the woods. They looked like tiny glimmers, white and distant, moving slowly between the trees. At first, I thought it was my eyes playing tricks on me, reflections of raindrops maybe. But they seemed to move, disappear, and then reappear in a different spot. I blinked and rubbed my eyes. When I looked again, they were gone. The woods were just black again. My chest felt tight, and I realized how quiet it had become. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, and even the wind seemed to have paused for a moment. The silence felt wrong. I decided to get inside the half-built cabin frame, thinking it would at least block some of the wind. I laid the tarp across one side like a temporary wall and sat against a beam, trying to stay warm. The sound of water dripping from the roof beams was steady and slow. I sat there for maybe half an hour before hearing another sound. A low, dragging noise, like something being pulled across wet ground. It wasn't loud, but it was close. I froze. It stopped after a few seconds. My heart was pounding hard enough that I could feel it in my throat. I waited, staring into the darkness. The dragging sound came again, closer this time. Then silence. I gripped the hammer I'd been using and stayed still. After what felt like minutes, I heard another sound. A soft thud, followed by another, like footsteps moving through mud. Not fast, but steady. They came from the direction of the trees behind the cabin. The fire had gone out by then, and I didn't dare turn on the lantern. I just sat there, holding the hammer, waiting for it to stop. After a long time, the sounds faded. I didn't move. My arms were tense, my back stiff against the wood. The rain started up again, slowly at first, then heavier until it drowned out everything else. I kept listening, but there was nothing, just the endless sound of water hitting the tarp. I finally let out a breath and tried to calm myself down. I told myself it was probably an animal. Maybe a deer or a bear had wandered close. I didn't see anything when I shone the flashlight toward the trees a few minutes later, just the rain falling and the shapes of wet branches. I didn't sleep much that night. Every sound made me sit up. The rain never stopped, and my mind wouldn't either. I thought about the road back, how soft the ground was, and if my truck would even make it out in the morning. Around 5 a.m., a pale light started to show through the trees. The rain had turned to a light drizzle again, and the forest had that gray-blue look that comes with early morning. When I stepped outside the half-built cabin, I saw something that made my stomach twist. About 20 feet from where I'd been sleeping, the ground was torn up, muddy drag marks leading from the trees to a shallow ditch near the edge of the clearing. The marks were wide, uneven, like something heavy had been pulled or dragged there recently. I followed them for a few steps before stopping. They went straight into the woods and vanished between the trees. I didn't want to know what had made them. I just knew I didn't hear it leave. I packed everything fast, tossing tools into the truck bed without caring how they landed. The rain had softened the road even more, but I pushed through it, tires spinning mud behind me. I didn't look in the mirrors until I was miles away. When I finally did, I saw the faint outline of the forest disappearing behind me, silent and dark under the rain. I never went back to finish that cabin. A month later, I sold the land cheap to a man who said he wanted to hunt out there. He called once after buying it, asking if I'd ever noticed the strange ditches near the tree line. I told him I hadn't seen much. That was the truth, in a way. I'd seen enough to know I didn't want to see more. Even now, when it rains at night, I still remember that sound. The dragging, the slow steps, the way the forest seemed to hold its breath. Sometimes, I wonder if the rain was hiding something worse that night, something I was lucky not to see. It was the end of September 2018 when I drove out to an old cabin I'd rented for a week in northern Montana. I'd been working construction in Missoula for months without a break, and I just wanted quiet. No cars, no coworkers, no traffic noise. I'd found the cabin through a small local website owned by some retired couple who rarely used it anymore. The pictures showed an old wooden structure surrounded by pines, with a dirt road winding through the forest. It looked perfect. The drive took nearly 5 hours. By the time I turned onto the unpaved road that led to the property, the sun had already started dipping behind the hills. The forest grew thick fast, the trees closing in until the road was barely more than 2 tire tracks through gravel and mud. I remember passing an old, rusted-out pickup on the side of the road, half buried in weeds. It looked like it hadn't moved in years. When I reached the cabin, it was smaller than I expected. Just a single story, with faded red paint peeling off the wooden boards. The roof sagged a little in the middle, and one of the window shutters was hanging crooked. But the porch looked sturdy enough, and there was a small shed out back. The air smelled like wet dirt and pine. It felt quiet in a way that was both peaceful and a little too still. Inside, the place was simple. A single main room with a bed in the corner, a small table, a sink, and a wood stove. The smell of old wood filled the place, mixed with something faintly metallic, like rust or dried blood, though I told myself it was probably just the old pipes. I dropped my bag, started a small fire, and made coffee on a propane stove. That first night, I barely noticed anything odd. The forest was loud with crickets and the occasional crack of branches, but that's normal in the woods. It wasn't until early morning that I woke up to the sound of something moving outside. It wasn't footsteps exactly, more like something heavy brushing against the outer wall. I stayed still for a while, listening. Then it stopped. I got up, checked outside through the window. The yard was empty except for my truck and the thin line of fog crawling along the ground. I went back to bed, convincing myself it had been a raccoon or deer. The next day, I spent hiking around the property. I found what looked like an old trail behind the cabin that led up a small ridge. There were half-collapsed wooden posts. Maybe it used to be fenced off. About a mile in, I found something strange. The ground opened into a small clearing, and in the center of it, there was a fire pit surrounded by stones, with blackened wood still half buried in the ash. Around it were small animal bones, not scattered but placed, arranged in a circle. I crouched down and picked one up. It was clean, smooth, white, like it had been boiled. I don't know why, but I felt an uncomfortable chill even though the sun was out. It wasn't like a ritual circle or anything dramatic like that. It just looked too neat. Someone had taken the time to lay everything out in perfect lines. I kicked over part of the circle and headed back down. When I got back to the cabin, I noticed something right away. The door wasn't closed the way I'd left it. It wasn't wide open, just unlatched, swinging slightly in the wind. I stood there for a few seconds before stepping closer. My truck keys were still on the table. My bag was still by the bed. But something was off. The blanket on the bed looked moved, and one of the windows, the one in the kitchen, was cracked open even though I hadn't touched it. That night, I didn't sleep much. Around midnight, I started hearing sounds again. Slow, dragging footsteps on the porch, the boards creaking under weight. I sat up in the dark, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my chest. The sound stopped and then came back, slower this time, right up to the wall. Then nothing. I waited, listening, not moving. After maybe 10 minutes, I heard it again, a long scrape like fingernails or a stick running down the side of the cabin. I didn't move until the sound faded completely. In the morning, I went outside to check. There were marks along the lower part of the wall, about knee-height, long, thin scratches in the wood. Could have been an animal, but they were straight, even. And in the mud below the porch steps were faint prints. Bare feet. I could see the toes clearly. I thought about packing up and leaving right then, but the nearest town was nearly 2 hours away, and my phone hadn't had signal since I'd driven up. I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe someone had camped nearby and wandered too close during the night. That evening, I kept the fire burning and stayed inside. Around 9 p.m., I noticed movement near the tree-line, something standing still between the trunks. At first, I thought it was just the shape of a tree, but then it shifted slightly. I froze. It was tall, thin, almost blending into the shadows. I stared for what felt like forever until the shape turned, and I realized it was a person. They were standing sideways, head tilted a little too much. No movement, no light from their direction, just stillness. I couldn't make out their face, but I saw the pale skin of their arms. I stayed by the window without moving, and after a long while, the figure slowly walked back into the trees. That night, I didn't sleep at all. Every noise felt too close, every sound sharp. I kept a flashlight in one hand and a knife from the kitchen in the other. The woods went completely silent at some point. No insects, no wind, just silence. Around 3 a.m., there was a sound from the shed out back. A single metallic clang like something had fallen. I wanted to ignore it, but the sound came again, louder. I moved to the back window, shining the flashlight through the glass. The beam caught the edge of the shed door. It was wide open. I watched for nearly 20 minutes. Nothing moved. Finally, I forced myself to step outside, keeping the light low. The air was cold, and the ground was damp under my boots. I reached the shed, heart hammering, and looked inside. The place was empty except for old tools, a broken chair, and a pile of firewood. But there was something new. A small piece of folded paper lying on the floor. I bent down, picked it up. It had one word written in shaky handwriting: "Stay." I dropped it and backed out, locking the cabin door behind me once I got in. I sat against the wall with my back to the corner until the sky started to lighten. When morning came, I packed everything as fast as I could. The air outside was thick with fog, and the forest was dead quiet. As I loaded my bag into the truck, I noticed something else. Footprints again, but fresh this time, circling the cabin. They led from the porch to the shed, then off into the trees. I didn't bother to look for whoever it was. I just got in the truck, started the engine, and drove. I didn't stop until I hit the highway. Later, when I got back to town, I called the owner of the cabin to tell them what happened. They sounded calm, almost like they weren't surprised. They said the place hadn't been rented in a long time because some folks had reported strange activity before. Tools going missing, food left out on the porch, footprints. The police had checked once, thought it was probably a squatter living in the woods. That night, lying in my apartment, I kept thinking about the word on that paper. Whoever wrote it had been close enough to get inside while I was there, maybe even while I slept. I still don't know who it was. Maybe someone living wild out there, maybe just a drifter who used that forest as shelter. But sometimes, when I'm driving late at night through wooded roads, I still catch myself glancing into the trees, looking for a pale face between the trunks, standing too still, watching. I never went back to that cabin, and I never will. It was early November of 2019 when I drove out to the Lake District in northwest England. I'd rented a small wooden cabin tucked away in a clearing near the edge of the forest. I wanted quiet, some time alone after months of constant work and city noise. I was 33 then, and my plan was simple. A week of solitude, hiking during the day, reading at night, cooking my own meals, and sleeping with no alarms or traffic sounds. I found the cabin on an old rental site, the kind that listed private places owned by individuals instead of companies. The photos showed a simple one-room space with a small kitchen, a wood stove, and a bed under a narrow window. It looked old but clean, the kind of place where silence would be easy. When I arrived that afternoon, the sky was heavy with gray clouds, and the air smelled like wet leaves. The path to the cabin was muddy, with ruts filled with cold water. I parked near the edge of the trees and carried my bags down the short trail. The cabin looked smaller than it had in the pictures, the wood darker, probably from years of rain. Moss grew along the lower logs, and the steps creaked as I climbed them. Inside, everything was just as described. A simple table, a small counter, a bed covered with a wool blanket, and a narrow window that looked out toward the forest. The smell of old wood and cold air filled the room. That first evening passed quietly. I unpacked my things, made tea, and lit the stove. The wind moved through the trees outside, and rain started tapping against the window. There was a steady rhythm to it that made the place feel isolated but peaceful. I read for a while and went to bed early, feeling tired from the long drive. I remember lying there, hearing the rain and the soft hiss of the stove cooling down. It was the kind of silence you rarely get anywhere else, just distant wind and water. The next day was cold but dry. I spent most of it walking along the forest path, taking photos and watching small birds move through the trees. The sun never fully came out, just a dull light through the gray sky. I didn't see anyone the whole time, not even another hiker. When I returned in the evening, it was starting to get dark. I made soup and sat by the window while eating. That's when I noticed something strange. Near the tree line, maybe 30 yards away, there was a shape. At first, I thought it was a fallen branch or part of a bush. Then it moved slightly. It was a person. It looked like a woman, standing still between the trees. She was wearing something pale, maybe gray or off-white, and she didn't move much. I stared for a few seconds, trying to make sense of it. It was far enough that I couldn't see her face clearly, just her figure. I remember feeling a sudden tightness in my chest. Not fear exactly, but that uneasy sense when you realize you're not alone somewhere you expected to be. I turned away to grab the flashlight, but when I looked back out the window, she was gone. I told myself she was probably another traveler, maybe staying in one of the cabins scattered around the area. I tried not to think about it. That night, the rain returned heavier than before. The roof made soft, cracking sounds as the wind pressed against it. Couldn't sleep well. Every small sound outside, the branches scraping, the wind hitting the wall, made me alert. Around midnight, I heard something different. A faint crunching sound like footsteps on wet leaves came from the side of the cabin, then stopped. I stayed still, listening, my heart beating fast. A few seconds later, I heard it again, this time closer. I didn't move. I just waited, holding my breath. Then nothing. Silence again. When morning came, the ground outside was soaked. I stepped out to get some air and saw faint footprints in the mud near the window. They were small, narrow, and led from the forest toward the back of the cabin. They stopped right under the window, the same one where I had seen her the night before. My stomach turned. The footprints weren't mine. I'd worn thick hiking boots with deep tread marks, but these were flat and light, like from thin shoes. I tried to convince myself they were old, maybe from before I arrived, but they looked fresh, still filled with rainwater. I didn't go hiking that day. I stayed close to the cabin, reading and trying to relax, though I kept glancing at the window every few minutes. The woods felt different, heavier somehow. Even when I couldn't see anyone, I had that strange sense of being watched. Around dusk, as I was stacking more wood by the stove, I glanced outside again. There she was, the same woman standing between the same trees. This time I could see her more clearly. Long dark hair hanging loose, her clothes looked damp and clung to her. She didn't move, just stood there facing the cabin. My hands started shaking. I didn't know what to do. The nearest house or cabin was at least a mile away, and it was getting dark fast. I locked the door, checked the window latch, and sat down on the floor beside the stove. I stayed there for almost an hour, listening, waiting. I didn't hear anything else that night. The next morning, I looked again. She was gone, but the footprints were back, deeper this time, like she'd been standing there for a while. I decided that was enough. I packed my things quickly and started the car. As I drove out, I noticed something odd near the gate that opened to the main road. There was a narrow wooden sign half buried in weeds, the paint almost gone. It said no trespassing, private land. I hadn't seen it when I arrived. Back in town, I stopped at a small shop to grab something to eat before the long drive home. The man behind the counter asked where I'd been staying. I told him about the cabin near the woods by the lake. His face changed slightly. He said that property had been empty for years. Apparently, the owner's daughter had disappeared somewhere in the forest in the late 1990s, and after that, no one really lived there again. The place was never officially rented. People sometimes camped there without permission. I didn't say much after that. I just nodded and left. The drive back to Manchester felt endless. Every stretch of forest looked the same: tall, wet trees and gray light. I couldn't stop thinking about the footprints, the way she stood there without moving, and how quiet it had been around her, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. When I got home, I checked the rental site again. The listing was gone. The photos, the contact number, everything deleted. I tried searching the address, but nothing came up except an old article about a missing woman near that area 20 years ago. Her photo was small and grainy, but I recognized the shape of her face, the dark hair, the pale clothing. For weeks afterward, I kept waking up at night, sure that I'd seen something at the edge of my backyard. I'd look out the window and see nothing but the dark garden and the fence. But sometimes, if I stood there long enough, I could almost imagine a shape. Still, silent, waiting just far enough away that I couldn't tell if it was real or just the memory of that cabin. I never went back to the Lake District after that. The cabin, the forest, the sound of rain on the roof. All of it stayed in my mind, too clear to forget. I don't know who that woman was or what she wanted, but I know what I saw. She was real as the footprints that led straight to my window and disappeared into the mud when I left. And sometimes, when the weather turns cold and the wind picks up outside my flat, I swear I can hear that same soft crunching sound. Footsteps on wet leaves, slow and steady, like someone walking toward the window again. It was late November, 2014, somewhere deep in the woods of northern Montana, where the cold felt sharper than metal and the wind never really stopped moving. I had taken a week off work to stay at an old hunting cabin that belonged to a friend of mine, just outside a small forgotten town called Haverly. I'd been there once before during summer, but that trip had been easy: blue skies, still air, long days. This time, the forest felt different. Everything looked harder, darker, stripped of color. The road leading up to the cabin was almost impossible to drive on after the first snow, but I made it in my truck, sliding a few times before the tires found solid ground again. The cabin sat in a small clearing surrounded by tall pine trees that leaned over the roof like they were watching it. It wasn't big, just one room with a small loft above, a stone fireplace, a narrow kitchen area, and a back door that led out to a broken-down shed. The windows had those old wooden frames that creaked when the temperature changed, and the smell inside was a mix of burnt wood, dust, and the faint sourness of something that had once been damp. I unloaded my gear, my rifle, a few boxes of ammo, a lantern, food, and a small cooler. The first night was quiet except for the wind hitting the sides of the cabin and the occasional crack of frozen branches outside. I sat by the fire, my dog Rex stretched out near the hearth, his fur rising and falling slowly with his breath. I remember staring at the flames and thinking how far I was from anything. No phone service, no nearby houses, just forest and snow. The next morning, I went out before sunrise. The cold bit at every inch of exposed skin, and the forest floor crunched under my boots. The plan was simple: hike east for about 2 miles to where a river cut through the woods, track any deer or elk prints, and work my way back before noon. I saw a few trails, but most were old. The snow was too deep and too fresh for much activity. Around midday, I turned back. When I reached the cabin, something felt slightly off. The snow around the steps was disturbed, more than what my boots had left. Could have been a deer or maybe even a coyote, but the prints were too close to the door. They weren't animal tracks either. They were boot marks, human. The thing was, they didn't come from the trail I'd made. They came from the tree line behind the shed. I remember standing there, just staring at them, counting how many there were. Looked like one person, heavy steps, walking straight to the door and then back again. Inside, nothing seemed out of place. The door was still locked. My rifle was where I'd left it, and Rex was calm. I figured maybe someone from town had been up there, a local hunter, maybe checking if the cabin was being used. Still, the thought didn't sit right with me. I kept my rifle closer that night. It was just after dark when I heard something out back. A faint crunch, like someone walking slowly through the snow near the shed. Rex lifted his head, ears pointing straight up, but he didn't growl. I turned off the lantern and waited, listening. The sound stopped after a few seconds. I went to the window, careful not to step too loud on the wooden floor, and looked out. The moon was bright enough to see the outlines of trees, the shed, and the narrow trail that led deeper into the woods. Nothing moved. The next morning, I went out there to look. Fresh boot prints again, same size, same direction, right up to the back of the cabin, then off toward the woods. No sign of anyone. I followed them maybe 30 yards before they vanished where the ground sloped down toward a frozen creek. Whoever it was knew the area well enough to move quietly and not leave much trace. That day, I barely hunted. I kept circling the cabin instead, checking windows, checking the shed, walking up and down the path. I started noticing small things I hadn't before. A broken tree branch near the edge of the clearing, a cigarette but half buried in snow, a scrap of gray fabric caught on a thorn bush. None of it made sense, but it all added to that feeling that I wasn't as alone as I thought. By the third night, I couldn't relax. I kept the fire going low, the rifle beside my chair, and I sat up late just listening. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again. The crunching of footsteps, slow and careful, circling the cabin this time. Not close enough to touch the walls, but close enough that I could hear the snow give way under each step. It stopped near the front door. I could feel my heartbeat pounding in my ears. Rex was standing now, silent, staring at the door with his fur raised slightly along his back. I didn't move for a long time. After maybe 5 minutes, the sound started again, fading away toward the woods. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I found new prints, but this time they were joined by a second set. Smaller, lighter, but definitely another person. 2 people had been walking around my cabin while I sat inside awake. I started thinking maybe someone was living out there, squatting in an old shack or tent, maybe watching for supplies to steal. It was a long drive back to town, and I didn't want to leave the place unattended. I decided I'd stay one more night, pack up early, and head out first thing in the morning. That last night was worse. The wind had picked up again, and snow was falling hard, tapping against the windows and roof. I sat near the fire, listening to the storm, trying to convince myself that it would drown out any sound of movement outside. But then, sometime after midnight, I heard the unmistakable sound of the back door handle moving, slow, steady pressure like someone testing it. The door didn't open. I'd locked it tight and wedged a chair under the knob. I grabbed my rifle and pointed it toward the back, my hands shaking so bad I could barely hold it still. Rex started growling low, a sound I'd never heard from him before. The handle stopped moving. Then came the sound of boots crunching through snow again, moving around the cabin, stopping at the window nearest to me. I could see the faint outline of a shadow through the thin curtains, a head, shoulders, the shape of a person standing just inches away from the glass. My heart felt like it was hammering in my throat. The shadow didn't move for almost a full minute. Then it backed away and disappeared into the dark. I stayed up till sunrise, never once putting the rifle down. When the light came through the windows, I went outside. The snow was covered in tracks, not just from one direction but from every side of the clearing, like they'd been circling for hours. Some were fresh, others half covered by falling snow. There were at least 2 sets again, maybe 3. I didn't even bother packing everything neatly. I threw what I could into the truck and left the rest. Some food, the cooler, a few blankets. The road out was barely visible under the snow, but I didn't stop driving until I reached the main highway. When I got back to town, I told the sheriff that someone had been around the cabin. He drove up there a day later, but when he came back, he said he didn't find much. Just footprints that had mostly blown over and signs of an old campfire about 50 yards from the cabin. Looked like someone had been living rough out there for weeks, maybe longer. I never went back to that cabin again. My friend eventually sold it, and I didn't ask who bought it. Sometimes, though, when I see a patch of snow or hear branches breaking in the dark, I remember those nights. The quiet pressure of being watched, the careful footsteps circling in the cold. It wasn't ghosts or anything like that. It was just people, real people, and that somehow makes it worse. It was late autumn of 2018 when I decided to spend a few weeks in a small cabin I had bought in northern Arizona, near the Coconino National Forest. I was 32 back then, and I had been working as a mechanic in Flagstaff for years. I wanted a break from the city noise, the constant smell of fuel and metal, and the endless work hours. The cabin wasn't anything fancy, just a single-story wooden place with a small porch, one bedroom, and an old stone fireplace that cracked whenever the wind blew strong. It sat about 6 miles off a gravel road, surrounded by pine trees that never seemed to end. There were no other houses around, no cell signal, and the closest town was more than half an hour away. The first week was quiet. I spent my time cutting wood, fixing the loose window frames, and hiking through the forest trails nearby. I liked the silence, the kind that made you hear the smallest things, like leaves moving or the wind dragging across the roof. My dog, a black and tan shepherd mix named Duke, stayed with me. He was always alert, always listening, especially at night when the woods got darker than anything I'd ever seen. One evening, around 6 or 7, I took Duke out for a walk before the sun disappeared. The air had that dry coldness that creeps in before winter, and the smell of pine was heavy. We followed a trail behind the cabin that led to a clearing with a half-frozen creek. I remember seeing a large deer standing near the water, watching us. Duke didn't bark or growl, he just froze. Something about the way that deer was standing didn't feel right. Its legs were stiff, too straight, and its head was tilted a little too far to one side, like its neck couldn't hold it up properly. I thought maybe it was sick or injured, but when I took a step forward, it moved, only it didn't move like a deer. It stepped backward, then turned and walked off slowly, its head still facing us. That image stuck with me the rest of the night. I didn't say anything out loud. I didn't even want to think about it much. I just told myself it was a deer acting strangely because of the cold or maybe because it smelled us. But Duke didn't settle after that. He kept pacing near the door, staring at the window, sometimes letting out a low growl that barely made a sound. A few nights later, around midnight, I woke up to the sound of something moving outside. Not running, just moving slow, steady, crunching through the dry leaves. Duke lifted his head off the floor, ears stiff. The sound circled the cabin once, maybe twice, before stopping near the back wall, close to where my bedroom was. The footsteps were light but deliberate, like someone was trying to move quietly but couldn't avoid the dry ground. I lay still, staring at the ceiling, waiting for it to go away. After a few minutes, it did. In the morning, I went outside to check, expecting to see maybe animal tracks. I found something, but not what I thought I would. The prints were almost like footprints, but too long, too narrow, and uneven, as if whoever or whatever made them was dragging their toes. They led from the tree line to the side of the cabin, then back into the woods. The dirt was disturbed in strange patches, and one of the logs near my woodpile had been pushed over. That day, I packed up most of my tools and kept the axe inside with me. I tried to act normal. Cooked breakfast, chopped more wood, took Duke for another walk. But something in the forest felt different. It wasn't just quiet now, it was heavy, like the air itself was watching. Even the birds seemed gone. By the fifth night, I couldn't sleep. I just lay there with Duke beside the bed, listening to the occasional creak of wood and the wind brushing against the windows. Around 2 a.m., Duke started growling again, low and deep. Then I heard it, the same slow crunching outside. Came closer this time, stopping right by the front porch. I could hear the old boards creak under the weight. My heart was beating so hard I could hear it in my ears. Then there was this faint scratching sound, like nails dragging across the wood. I wanted to believe it was a coyote or something small, but the sound of those footsteps was too heavy. I got up quietly, picked up the axe, and moved toward the window beside the door. The moonlight was bright enough that I could see the porch clearly. There was someone or something standing there. It looked human, but wrong. The body was thin, too tall, with limbs that didn't hang right. The arms were longer than they should have been, and the head seemed too small for the shoulders. It was wearing what looked like torn, dirty clothes, but they were hanging loose like they didn't fit. Its skin, or what I could see of it, was pale and stretched tight. It was just standing there, slightly hunched, facing the door. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. Duke was silent, his teeth showing but no sound coming out. The figure didn't move either. It just stayed there for what felt like minutes before stepping backward off the porch and disappearing into the trees. I stood there for a long time after that, waiting to hear something else, but the woods went completely still again. The next morning, I thought about leaving. I really did, but the road was rough, and the weather forecast said snow might hit soon. I convinced myself that maybe it was some local drunk who had wandered too far into the woods. Still, I started keeping the axe and a loaded rifle next to the bed. The final night was the worst. It was colder than usual, and I had built up the fire high. I remember the smell of burning pine and the sound of the wind scraping across the metal roof. Around midnight, Duke started whining. Not growling, whining. I sat up and saw him staring at the window again, tail down, shaking slightly. Then I heard something dragging outside, like someone was pulling a bag through the dirt. The sound moved from one side of the cabin to the other, slow and heavy. I forced myself to look through the small window near the back. I could barely see through the frost, but I made out something pale moving between the trees, too tall, moving on all fours but awkwardly, like it didn't belong that way. When it turned toward the cabin, I saw its face, or what I thought was its face. It looked like a person's face, but twisted, stretched in a way that made it look both real and completely wrong at the same time. That was the moment I decided I couldn't stay. I grabbed my jacket, stuffed a few things into a bag, and loaded Duke into the truck. I didn't care about the storm warnings or the dark roads. I drove straight down that narrow path, the truck bouncing on every rock and rut. In the side mirror, I could see the faint outline of the cabin growing smaller, swallowed by the trees. By the time I hit the main road, the sun was coming up. I didn't stop driving until I reached town. I sold the cabin a few months later without ever going back. The buyer was some guy from Phoenix who wanted a quiet getaway. I didn't tell him about what happened. I didn't tell anyone. Even now, when I think back, I try to make sense of it. Maybe it was a wild animal or a person living off the grid, sick and half-starved. Maybe my mind twisted what I saw because of the isolation. But deep down, I know what I saw wasn't normal. Sometimes, when I drive through the forest roads, I still feel that same weight in the air. The trees seem to hold something behind them, something that watches but never shows itself fully. I haven't gone camping since then, and I don't plan to. The woods used to feel peaceful to me. Now they just feel like they're waiting for something to come back. And every time I hear a branch snap in the distance, I remember that night. The way that thing moved, the way it stood in front of my cabin, too still to be human but too real to be anything else. It was early October of 2014 when I decided to stay at my uncle's old farm cabin in northern Kansas. He had passed away a few years back, and the property had been empty since then. It wasn't much, just a small cabin surrounded by overgrown fields and a few collapsed barns. I was 32 then, tired of city noise, tired of crowds, and I thought spending a week there would clear my head. The cabin was isolated, about a mile from the nearest dirt road, and the only sound I could hear when I arrived was the wind dragging itself across the tall, dry grass. The cabin had that faint smell of dust and wood rot that never really leaves old places. The front steps sagged when I stepped on them, and the screen door creaked loud enough to echo inside the empty house. The living room was small, with a broken recliner, a wooden table, and an old kerosene heater in the corner. I remember brushing off a thick layer of dust from the table and wiping the dirt off the single window to let some light in. Outside, the fields stretched out endlessly, golden and dry under the weak autumn sun. There was no electricity, no running water. My uncle used to live off the grid, and I brought a small generator and a few gas cans to keep a light on at night. The air was dry and sharp, and everything about that place felt like time had stopped. I spent most of the first day cleaning, sweeping dead insects from the corners, tossing out old rags, and shaking the smell of stale wood from the rooms. I didn't realize until later how quiet it really was out there. Not peaceful quiet, more like a silence that pressed against your ears. Even the wind seemed hesitant. The first night was fine. I had a small fire going in the metal heater, and the dim orange light filled the room. The generator hummed faintly outside, and the sound was oddly comforting. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring at the wooden ceiling, hearing the occasional pop from the heater as it cooled down. Around midnight, I heard a faint thud from somewhere outside, like something falling. I figured it was just the wind knocking something over, so I ignored it. The place had been abandoned for years. Animals probably nested all around it. The second day, I walked around the property. The barns were half collapsed, the wooden beams gray and brittle. Rusted tools lay scattered near the old tractor that hadn't moved in decades. The fields were empty. No crops, just brittle stalks and dry soil cracking under my boots. Near the edge of the property, there was a barbed wire fence that stretched for what seemed like miles, and beyond it was a line of trees marking the edge of the neighboring land. Everything looked lifeless, abandoned, and left to rot. I remember the uneasy feeling of being watched, though there was no one around for miles. That thought crept in more than once, especially when I noticed faint tracks in the dirt near the cabin. Not animal tracks, but boot prints. That night, I set up a lantern on the table and read for a while, trying not to think about those tracks. Around 10 p.m., I turned off the generator to save fuel and sat by the heater. The silence hit me again, thick and heavy. I could hear every creak of the cabin, every little sound the wood made as it settled. Then, faintly, I heard something move outside. Not just a single noise, a series of faint, slow steps in the dirt. I froze, listening. It was close, maybe a few yards from the wall behind me. The steps stopped, and I sat there for what felt like forever, waiting. After a few minutes, I told myself it had to be a deer or maybe a stray dog. But then I heard something scrape against the wall. It was slow, deliberate, like metal or wood dragging lightly along the outer boards. I didn't move. My breathing sounded too loud in the silence. The scraping stopped, followed by another few steps, then nothing. I stayed awake until nearly dawn, sitting up with my flashlight in my hand, eyes fixed on the window. When I finally went outside in the morning, I checked the ground behind the cabin. The dirt was soft from an earlier drizzle, and there were footprints there, definitely human. Deep, heavy prints that circled the cabin once before stopping near the back door. I knelt down, studying them, and felt that sinking feeling in my gut. Whoever it was had been standing there, maybe watching through the window. I didn't have cell service that far out, and the nearest town was almost an hour away. I thought about leaving, but I didn't want to panic over something that could have been some random drifter or hiker passing through. I told myself I'd just stay one more night and head back the next morning. I locked the doors before sunset, pushed a chair under the knob just in case, and kept the lantern close. That night, I didn't turn on the generator. I wanted it quiet so I could hear everything. Around 1 a.m., I heard it again, those same slow footsteps. This time, they came from the front porch. The wood creaked softly under the weight of whoever was there. Then came the sound of the screen door moving slightly, like someone pressing it but not enough to open it. My chest felt tight, and I could feel sweat building on my neck. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe too hard. After a long few seconds, the sound stopped. But then came something else. A faint tapping on the window. 3 short taps, then silence. I stayed frozen for what felt like hours. When the first light of dawn started to show through the curtains, I finally stood up. I pushed the door open slowly, the air outside cold and still. The porch was empty, but near the steps, I saw it again. Boot prints, same as before, only this time they were deeper. There was something else too, an old metal hook lying in the dirt, like the kind used for hanging buckets or tools. I didn't know if it had fallen from the barn or if someone had dropped it. That was enough for me. I packed everything in less than an hour, threw my gear into the truck, and started down the dirt path. As I drove away, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing in the field. The road was long, winding, and empty, and it took nearly 20 minutes before I reached the main highway. I remember how strange it felt when I finally saw other cars, like I'd been gone longer than just a couple of nights. A few weeks later, I got a call from the county sheriff's office. They had found signs of someone living out near the old farmland. Small campfires, bits of food wrappers, and footprints near a few abandoned cabins in the area. They said it looked like a man had been squatting around there for months, maybe longer, moving from one place to another. No one ever caught him. The neighbors said they sometimes saw lights in the fields late at night, but figured it was hunters. I never went back to that cabin. The thought of someone walking around the walls while I slept, watching through the window, still makes my stomach turn. It wasn't anything supernatural, just another human being out there, quiet and patient, waiting in the dark. And that, somehow, felt worse than anything else I could have imagined. Even now, when I think about those nights, I can still hear the slow crunch of footsteps in the dirt, moving closer, pausing just long enough to let me know that whoever it was, they weren't just passing through. They had been there for a reason. It was 2016 when I first came to the Amazon rainforest. I was 29 then, working on a field documentation project that required staying deep inside the forest for weeks at a time. I wasn't a tourist or an adventurer. It was just work. I had agreed to stay in a small wooden cabin near a river, around a 2-hour boat ride from the nearest small village called Itapiranga. The cabin was originally built by a research group years ago, but they'd stopped using it because of flooding and isolation. It was still standing, though weathered, leaning slightly to one side like it had grown tired over the years. I arrived during the rainy season. The air was heavy, always damp. Everything smelled of wet leaves and soil that never seemed to dry. The mosquitoes were relentless, and I could hear insects whining constantly, even at night. The cabin sat on a patch of raised dirt surrounded by tall trees, and from the porch, I could see the brown, slow-moving river twisting through the forest. My only link to the outside world was a small satellite radio, which I used every few days to check in. During the first few days, nothing unusual happened. I spent my time gathering samples, taking photos, and writing notes. The forest was alive in every direction. Monkeys in the trees, birds screaming across the canopy, frogs calling from the water. But at night, it changed. The noise of animals faded into something deeper and harder to explain. The silence wasn't peaceful. It felt like the forest was holding its breath. On the fifth night, I woke up around midnight to a strange sound outside. It was steady, rhythmic, like something dragging along the ground. It wasn't close at first, just faint scraping mixed with the constant chirping of insects. I thought maybe it was an animal, maybe a tapir or some large rodent. I didn't move, I just listened. The dragging sound stopped for a while, then started again, closer this time. It came from behind the cabin, where the ground sloped down toward the river. I stayed awake until it faded away completely. The next morning, I went outside to check. Behind the cabin, the dirt was soft and dark. I saw a long mark in the mud, a kind of groove leading from the tree line to the edge of the clearing. It looked like something had been pulled through the mud, or someone had dragged something heavy. The marks went both directions. I followed them only a few steps before stopping. The forest floor was too dense ahead, and my nerves got the better of me. That afternoon, I tried to focus on my work, but I kept thinking about that sound. When it started raining again, I went inside early. The rain drummed on the tin roof for hours. When it finally slowed, I decided to step out onto the porch for air. The smell of wet earth was strong, and everything glistened under the weak light from my flashlight. Then I saw something that froze me completely. The same dragging marks were back, but this time they were fresh. They ran across the yard, right up to the steps of the porch, then turned back toward the trees. The mud was still wet, shiny, and disturbed like it had happened only minutes earlier. I stood there, staring at the marks, listening. I could hear nothing except the faint hiss of insects. My throat felt dry even though the air was thick with moisture. I went back inside and bolted the door. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing faint sounds outside. Cracks, rustles, light thuds. But I forced myself not to move, not to even breathe loudly. I stayed under the thin sheet until morning, counting the seconds, waiting for daylight. The next few days were worse. Every morning I found new signs. Small prints in the mud near the cabin, disturbed soil, pieces of bark stripped from the trees. It looked deliberate, not random like animal movement. I couldn't figure it out. The feeling of being watched became constant. Even during the day, I'd feel something behind me when I walked into the forest. Once, while I was collecting samples near the river, I thought I saw movement between the trees. Not fast, not clear, just a dark shape that shifted and then disappeared. On the 9th day, I made up my mind to leave early. The thought of spending another night there made my stomach twist. But the weather turned again, and the river rose too much for safe travel. I had no choice but to wait it out. That night, the air felt different. Still heavy, tense. The forest was quiet, quieter than I'd ever heard it. Around midnight, the dragging sound came back, closer than before. It wasn't behind the cabin this time. It was on the porch. I heard wood creak under weight. Then it stopped. I was sitting on the floor by my bed, holding a flashlight, but I didn't turn it on. The silence stretched for what felt like hours. Then a slow scraping sound moved along the outside wall, right by where my head was resting against the boards. The noise slid across the wood, soft but deliberate, like something brushing a stick or knife along the surface. My pulse hammered so hard I thought I'd pass out. Then, after what felt like forever, the sound faded toward the river again. When morning came, I forced myself to open the door. I expected to see tracks again, and I did. But this time, I found something else too. In the mud at the bottom of the porch steps, I saw deep indentations, not like footprints, but more like the corners of a wooden crate or box that had been dragged across the yard. There were small bits of rope fibers tangled in the wet dirt. Whatever it was, it looked like someone had been pulling something heavy toward the trees again. I followed the trail, this time going farther than before. The path wound between thick roots and ferns, down toward the water. When I reached the riverbank, I saw it. A large, half-buried metal drum lying on its side, rusted but sealed with a tight lid. The drag marks led right to it. I stood there staring at it, realizing that whatever had been moved night after night was this. Someone had been dragging it, maybe trying to hide it or move it somewhere else. The drum was too heavy to lift, but there was a small puncture near the rim. Inside, I could smell something foul, chemical, and rotten at the same time. It hit me in the face, and I stumbled back, gagging. My first thought was that it could be industrial waste or something dumped illegally. But there was something else about it. The smell wasn't just chemical. It had a sour, decayed edge that made my stomach turn. I didn't touch it again. I ran back to the cabin, grabbed my pack, and by noon I was gone. The river was high and rough, but I didn't care. I steered the small boat until I reached the village by evening, soaked and shaking. I didn't stop to explain much. I just told them I had to leave. A week later, when I was back in Manaus, I told a local contact about the drum. He said he'd send someone to check it out. Months passed before I heard anything else. Then one day an email came through. They'd found the drum, or what was left of it. It had burst open in the rain. Inside were bones, clothes, and what looked like remains wrapped in plastic and tape. Whoever had been dragging that thing around the cabin wasn't an animal. It was a person. They never found out who it was or where the body came from. No signs of anyone else in the area, no tools, no camps. Just the old cabin, still standing by the river, quiet and half-rotted, like it had been waiting for someone to notice. Even now, I sometimes wake up at night thinking about that scraping sound. Slow, heavy, dragging through the mud. I can still picture the marks outside the porch, the wet dirt, the half-open forest waiting just beyond the light. I tell myself it's over, that it was just something I stumbled into by accident, but deep down I know that whoever or whatever was moving that drum had been doing it long before I got there. And maybe on nights when the rain comes hard, they're still out there by the river, pulling something else through the mud. It was early November 2021 when I drove through the back roads of northern Montana, trying to make it to Great Falls before nightfall. The air was already colder than usual for that time of year, and a low fog hung across the open fields, blurring the outlines of trees and fence posts. I had been driving since sunrise, and after hours of staring at the same endless line of the highway, everything started to blend together. The frost-covered grass, the pale sky, and the long stretch of gray asphalt. It had been almost 8 years since I'd last driven through that area. Back then, I'd lived there with my ex-wife, Allison. We had a small cabin deep in the woods, about a half hour off the main road. We bought it when we were in our early 30s, both of us thinking we wanted to live quietly, away from noise and people. It worked for a while, but by the end, we barely spoke, and I moved out after one last bitter winter. I hadn't thought much about that place in years, but as I passed the old turnoff road that led there, I caught myself slowing down. The wooden post with the faded green sign, Riverside Trail, was still there, tilting to one side. The gravel path behind it looked half buried under weeds and pine needles. I didn't even plan it, but my hands turned the wheel before I could talk myself out of it. I told myself I just wanted to see what had become of it. Maybe it had been torn down. Maybe it was someone else's now. But part of me, I think, just wanted to face something I'd left unfinished. The path twisted through thick woods, the kind that swallowed all sound. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. The road was rougher than I remembered. Deep ruts, broken branches, and potholes filled with brown water. My tires cracked over twigs as I inched forward. It felt like driving into a forgotten world. The trees leaned in close, their bare branches scraping the sides of my truck. After a few minutes, I started to see pieces of the old property. The rusted mailbox, the half-collapsed wooden fence, the shape of the hill that sloped down toward the creek. And then, through the mist and trees, I saw it. The cabin still stood there, small and dark, just as I remembered, except older, worn down, and almost sinking into the ground. The once red paint had faded into a dull brown. The roof sagged on one side, the chimney crumbled halfway down, and the windows were coated with grime. The steps leading up to the porch were split and crooked. Even from the car, I could see the front door was slightly open. I parked near the old shed, where the grass had grown tall enough to hide half the tires of my truck. I turned off the engine, and for a few seconds the silence pressed in like a weight. There was no wind, no birds, no sound at all, just the faint ticking of the cooling engine. I got out and stood there, staring at the cabin. The air smelled damp and earthy, mixed with a faint metallic scent that I couldn't place. My boots sank into the soft ground as I walked up to the porch. Each board creaked beneath my weight. I looked at the door again, the same one I'd slammed for the last time 8 years ago. It was cracked along the edge and hanging loosely from one hinge. I pushed it open slowly. Inside, it was darker than I expected. The curtains were still up, blocking what little light filtered through the fog. The air was thick with dust and the smell of rot. The living room looked almost the same, only covered in decay. The old couch sat in the corner, the fabric torn open, stuffing spilling out like dried moss. The small table near the window was still there, though one leg had snapped and it leaned to one side. I moved deeper inside, my boots crunching on bits of glass and fallen plaster. There were faint water stains running down the walls, and in one spot, I saw where part of the ceiling had collapsed. The place felt frozen in time, everything left behind like someone meant to come back but never did. On the kitchen counter, I saw a few things that made me stop. An old mug, chipped along the rim, the one I used to drink coffee from every morning. Beside it was a plate with a faded pattern of blue flowers, cracked down the middle. I don't know why, but seeing that plate gave me a heavy feeling in my chest. It was the same one Allison always used, the one she'd pack my breakfast on before work. I walked to the back of the cabin where our old bedroom used to be. The door was swollen and stuck, but I forced it open. The bed frame was still there, the mattress gray and caved in. The window had been broken, glass scattered across the floor. The smell was worse there, a sour, moldy stench mixed with the faint scent of wet wood. In the corner, the old dresser was half collapsed, the drawers hanging open. Then I noticed something strange, small piles of things. Near the foot of the bed, someone had stacked old newspapers, tin cans, and bits of fabric, all neatly arranged. On top of one pile was a small metal cup. Another pile near the closet had bones, small ones maybe from a raccoon or rabbit. Everything looked organized, not random, like someone had been living there or at least using the space. I felt uneasy but couldn't turn back. I went to the back window and looked outside. The woods behind the cabin were thick and dark, and I could see a faint trail leading down to the creek. For a second, I thought I saw movement, something pale slipping between the trees. But when I blinked, it was gone. I decided to step outside and check around before the light faded. I walked behind the cabin where the small tool shed used to be. The door was missing, and inside were empty cans, old clothes, and the remains of a campfire built from broken furniture pieces. Someone had definitely been staying there. The footprints in the dirt were uneven, some small, some larger, like more than one person had passed through recently. My stomach turned when I saw a faded piece of fabric tied around a tree nearby. It was an old shirt, one I recognized. I didn't remember leaving it there, but it was definitely mine. That was when it hit me that maybe someone had been watching this place for a long time, collecting pieces of what was left here, and maybe even of me. The wind picked up then, carrying a sharp, cold chill. I turned and saw that the cabin door was now closed, though I knew I hadn't touched it. I stood there, staring at it, the sound of the creaking would echoing faintly. I told myself it was the wind, just the wind, nothing else. But something about it didn't sit right. I backed away slowly, scanning the tree line. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, that quiet, prickling awareness that crawls along the back of your neck. I couldn't see anyone, but the silence had changed. It wasn't empty anymore. It was waiting. I got back in the truck, locked the doors, and started the engine. The sound of it breaking the silence was almost comforting. As I turned around, my headlights swept across the cabin one last time. That's when I saw it, in the window of the back room, just behind the torn curtain, the faint outline of something. A shape. It wasn't moving, but it was there, human-sized, still as stone. I didn't stay to look. I pressed down on the gas and drove back up the trail, my tires sliding over the wet gravel. I didn't breathe right until I hit the main road again and saw the headlights of another car passing by. That night, I stopped at a small motel near the highway. The whole drive, I couldn't stop thinking about the piles, the shirt, the door closing. I told myself it was probably some drifter using the place, maybe a hunter or someone homeless. That made the most sense. But when I took off my jacket before bed, I noticed something that froze me in place. There was mud smeared along the back of my collar, not from the path, but from a handprint. A small one, thin fingers streaked with dark soil. That's when I knew someone had been closer than I realized. And that cabin, that part of my past I thought I'd buried, wasn't as empty as it looked. I never went back there again. I sold the land a few months later through an agent without ever seeing it in person. Sometimes, late at night, I still wonder if whoever stayed there before is still inside, or if they followed the path I left behind, watching for anyone else who comes back. It was late October 2011 when I decided to take a week off from work and spend it alone in a small cabin in northern Montana. I had been working nonstop for months at a construction company in Billings, and I felt like I needed a break from everything. No noise, no people, no deadlines, just silence. I found a small listing online, an old hunting cabin that sat a few miles away from a dried-up lake. The photos looked rough, but it was cheap, and that's all I cared about. The drive took almost 8 hours. Most of the road was paved until I turned onto a long dirt trail that wound through thick pine woods. My truck bounced over uneven ground and loose rocks. There were no other houses or signs of life anywhere around. Just trees, endless trees, and a few broken fences swallowed by the forest. When I finally reached the cabin, it was smaller than I expected, almost hidden behind overgrown bushes. The paint was peeling, and the roof looked like it hadn't seen repair in decades. I remember stepping out of the truck and hearing nothing. No birds, no wind, no cars in the distance. Just silence. The kind of silence that makes you aware of your own breathing. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood and dust. There was one small bedroom with a rusted bed frame, a kitchen area with a small sink and a gas stove that looked ancient, and a front room with a wood stove. I swept the floor, wiped down the counters, and opened the windows to let fresh air in. The air outside was sharp and cold. I unpacked my few things: a bag of clothes, some canned food, a flashlight, a map, and a hunting knife I always carried on trips. The first night went quietly. I lit the wood stove and listened to the popping and cracking of the fire. I sat in the old chair by the window and stared out into the darkness. The only light outside was from the moon, pale and washed out through thin clouds. It felt strange how dark it got out there. Back home, there were always lights, street lights, cars, signs. But here, when the fire went low, everything became pitch black. The next morning, I woke up to a light frost outside. I decided to walk down toward the lake bed, about a mile away. The trail was narrow and covered in dead leaves that crunched under my boots. Halfway down, I noticed tire tracks in the dirt. They weren't mine. They looked fresh, maybe from a day or two before. But there were no other cabins around for miles, at least not that I saw on the map. At the lake, the ground was cracked and dry, with bits of old wood and trash scattered around. Beer cans, an old boot, and the remains of a campfire. Someone had been there not too long ago. I stayed a while, then headed back before the sun went down. That night, while sitting by the fire again, I thought I heard something outside. It sounded like something, or someone, walking through the leaves near the back of the cabin. I froze, listening. A slow, uneven crunching sound moved behind the cabin, then stopped. I waited for several minutes, barely breathing. Then nothing. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or raccoon, and forced myself to relax. Still, I locked the door that night before going to bed. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt near the back of the cabin. Human ones. They weren't mine. The prints were deep and wide, made by heavy boots. They led up to the back wall of the cabin and stopped right under the window where I slept. My stomach turned when I saw them. Someone had stood there during the night, watching. I didn't see anyone around, though. The woods looked the same as always, quiet and still. I tried to convince myself that maybe the prints were old, or that a hiker had wandered by. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that I wasn't alone. That afternoon, I took the truck and drove a few miles down the dirt road to see if there were any other cabins or maybe a ranger station. The road split at one point and one path looked even rougher and narrower. I followed it for a while and eventually came to a clearing with an old camper van parked there. It looked abandoned, flat tires, broken windows, rusted frame. But when I got closer, I saw a newer folding chair and a half-empty can of beans sitting beside a small campfire pit. Whoever it was, they were still around. I didn't stay long. I turned around and headed back to the cabin before dark. When I got back, the sun was already low, throwing long shadows across the yard. The door to the cabin was slightly open. I knew for sure I had locked it. Inside, everything looked the same at first, until I noticed my backpack had been moved from the corner to the table. The zipper was halfway open. Nothing was missing, but someone had definitely gone through it. I felt a cold wave of panic wash through me. Whoever had been there during the night had come back while I was gone. I decided to pack up and leave the next morning. I didn't want to drive down that rough road at night. I tried to sleep, but I couldn't. Every noise outside made my heart jump. Around midnight, I heard that crunching sound again. Slow steps moving around the side of the cabin. The steps stopped. Then there was a light scraping sound against the back wall, like something dragging along the wood. I held my breath, clutching the hunting knife in my hand, waiting for it to stop. After several minutes, I heard the faint sound of the door handle move, just once. Then silence again. I stayed awake until dawn. When the light finally came through the window, I walked outside. The first thing I saw were the footprints again. Fresh ones, this time circling the cabin. They led off into the woods behind the cabin. I followed them about 20 yards before I stopped. There was a small spot where someone had sat. Flattened grass, a few cigarette butts, and an old army blanket rolled up beside a tree. Someone had been living out there, watching the cabin, maybe for days. I packed everything up fast. As I was loading the truck, I noticed something else. On the driver's side door, scratched faintly into the dirt and paint, were the words, "Stay quiet." The letters were shaky and uneven, written with something sharp. I just stared at it for a long moment. Then I got in, locked the doors, and drove out of there without looking back. The dirt road felt twice as long on the way out. Every tree I passed felt like it was hiding something behind it. I didn't stop once until I hit the main road again and saw power lines stretching along the highway. Only then did I start to breathe normally again. When I finally got home, I called the sheriff's office in that county and told them about the cabin and the tracks and the van I saw. The deputy said they'd send someone to check it out. A week later, I got a call back. They told me the cabin was empty when they went, but they did find signs that someone had been camping nearby. Old food cans, footprints, a blanket, and some personal items. They said it was probably a squatter, maybe someone hiding out in the woods. That should have been the end of it, but a few months later, I read a short piece in the local paper about a missing hiker found dead not far from that area. Deep in the woods, near a dried lake. No foul play confirmed, but they mentioned he had been living rough for months. No ID, no address, just a name someone recognized from another state. I think about that trip sometimes. How quiet it was out there, how peaceful it seemed at first. Then I think about those footprints and how close that person must have been while I was sleeping. Just standing there behind the window watching. I never went back to any cabin after that. Every time I see a photo of a quiet place in the woods now, I don't think about peace or silence anymore. I just think about that night, about the sound of footsteps in the leaves, slow and steady, moving closer in the dark. It was the summer of 2016 when I took the seasonal job as a park ranger at Black Pine National Forest in northern Oregon. I was 31 then, tired of working in the city, and I thought the quietness of the woods would clear my head for a while. The forest was huge, dense pines stretching over miles of steep ridges, narrow trails, and cold streams that cut through the valleys. I was assigned to an old ranger cabin about 12 miles from the main ranger station. It wasn't much, just a small wooden structure sitting near a dirt access road, surrounded by thick trees that never seemed to let in enough light even during the day. The cabin had no running water, no electricity except a small generator, and a shortwave radio for checking in with the station once every morning and evening. My job was to patrol certain sections of the forest, mark fallen trees, check the fire risk levels, and make sure no campers were breaking the rules. It sounded simple enough, and I liked the idea of being alone. I didn't realize how quiet could start to feel wrong after a few weeks. The first 2 weeks went by normally. The days were long, filled with the usual heat, insects, and the smell of pine sap baking under the sun. I got used to the sound of the woods at night, crickets, distant owls, branches shifting with the wind. I wrote reports, cooked on a propane stove, and spent the evenings reading by the weak light of a lantern. But after the 3rd week, something changed. Started small. I'd find strange piles of sticks near the trail markers, like small triangles or circles arranged deliberately. At first, I thought it was kids from the nearby campground. Then I realized these were in areas miles away from any campsite. Once, I came across a deer carcass that had been torn open, but not eaten. The organs were gone, like someone had removed them carefully. I told myself it was poachers, maybe someone hunting illegally and performing some sort of field dressing. But something about it didn't fit. The cuts were too clean, too neat for a knife used in the dark. One morning, I went out early to check a section of trail that had been reported blocked by a fallen tree. It was barely dawn when I left the cabin. The air was cold and still, and the ground was damp from rain the night before. As I got deeper into the woods, I started noticing footprints, bare human footprints. Not boot tracks, not shoes, bare feet. The prints were small, but they sank deep into the mud, meaning whoever made them was heavy or carrying something. They followed along the trail for nearly half a mile before turning off into the trees. That night, I couldn't relax. I kept listening to every little noise outside the cabin. Around midnight, I heard what sounded like wood cracking near the back of the cabin, like a branch snapping under weight. The cabin had one window facing the woods, and I sat there for almost an hour watching, trying to see through the darkness. I couldn't see anyone, but I could hear faint movement. A slow shuffle, a pause, then more movement. Eventually, it went quiet again. The next morning, I found fresh mud on the cabin's porch, smeared near the doorframe. I checked around the area and found another set of barefoot prints, smaller this time. I followed them a short way before they disappeared into the thick brush. I didn't report it right away. I didn't want to sound paranoid, but it stuck with me the rest of the day. That evening, I checked in with the main station over the radio. They said another ranger had found signs of illegal camping a few miles west, near a section of forest that wasn't open to the public. It crossed my mind that whoever was out here might be connected to that. Maybe squatters or someone living off-grid. The idea didn't make me feel any better. The next few days were uneventful, though I started noticing how quiet the woods had become. Birds didn't sing as much near the cabin anymore. Even the usual rustle of animals in the brush seemed to fade. The nights were heavier, more silent, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Then, one afternoon, I found something that made my stomach turn. About 2 miles from the cabin, near a narrow creek, I found a campsite. It wasn't new, the fire pit was cold, and the ground was littered with small bones, some burned, some not. There was a torn blue tarp tied between 2 trees, and under it, I found pieces of clothing, men's shirts, a pair of jeans, even what looked like a child's shoe. Everything was damp and smelled like rot. The creepiest part was a small notebook lying near the fire pit. It was soaked through, most of the pages unreadable, but a few words were still visible. Scrawled in shaky handwriting were the words, "Stayed too long. He watches at night. And don't look." I packed the notebook in a plastic bag and took it back to the cabin. That night, I decided to keep the generator off to listen for any sounds more clearly. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to something hitting the side of the cabin. Not hard, but enough to shake the thin walls. Then it came again, 3 dull thuds. I stayed still, heart pounding, listening. I reached for my flashlight and quietly looked out the window. Nothing, just the darkness of the trees. But then I saw movement near the tree line. Something or someone slipping between the trunks, just far enough that I couldn't make out any details. I stayed awake until sunrise. The next morning, I found a long scrape on the side of the cabin where the sound had come from. The wood was gouged deep, as if something sharp had dragged across it. I finally radioed the station and told them something was wrong, that someone might be out here. They said they'd send a team up in 2 days, but weather delays might make it longer. That didn't help much. Those 2 days felt endless. I barely slept, keeping the lantern on and the rifle close. On the second night, I heard footsteps circling the cabin, slow and steady. I didn't move. I just listened. The steps would stop, then start again, sometimes closer, sometimes farther. The sound went on for nearly an hour before fading away into the woods. The next morning, I walked out around the cabin and found dozens of footprints in the dirt, bare feet, different sizes, overlapping. Some were small, like a child's. They led off toward the creek, where they vanished again. By the time the rescue team arrived 2 days later, I was exhausted. I told them everything, showed them the footprints, the scrape marks, and the notebook. They spent the day searching but didn't find anyone. The camp by the creek had been cleared out, completely gone. The tarp, the clothes, even the bones. Everything was missing like it had never been there. When they drove me back to the main station, I felt like I was waking from a bad dream. I tried to convince myself it was some group of squatters who moved on before we got there. That explanation made the most sense, though it didn't feel complete. A few weeks later, when I handed in my resignation papers, one of the older rangers told me something that stuck with me. Years ago, before the forest became a national park, people used to live deep in those woods. Families that didn't want contact with the outside world. When the government forced them to leave, not everyone did. Some just vanished into the trees. I don't know if that's who I heard out there. I never went back to that cabin. But sometimes, when I think about it, I remember those small footprints by the door and the way the woods went so quiet. Like the forest itself was listening. And I realized something. Silence can be louder than any scream when you're alone, miles from anyone, with nothing but the dark outside your walls. It was late October 2013. The air was sharp and dry, and the smell of fallen pine needles and damp soil carried through the forest. My boss, Mark, had invited me to spend a weekend at his cabin, deep in the woods near the Canadian border. He called it a team-building retreat, though it felt more like an excuse for him to get away from his wife and emails. I didn't want to go, but saying no to your boss when you're still trying to keep your job isn't exactly smart. So I packed up a duffel bag, threw in a few clothes, a flashlight, and my old hunting knife, and met him early that Saturday morning. Mark drove. He had one of those big, silver pickup trucks that looked like it had never seen dirt before. I sat in the passenger seat while the tires chewed up the gravel road that led deeper into the forest. The trees got thicker the farther we went, swallowing the morning light. The radio didn't work that far out, and the GPS kept losing signal. Every few miles, I glanced back at the road we came from, and each time it looked narrower, darker, less inviting to return through. After nearly 4 hours, the forest opened up to a small clearing where his cabin stood. It wasn't much, just a single-story log structure with a rusted tin roof and a porch that leaned slightly to one side. Behind it was a shed and a water pump that looked like it hadn't worked in years. The place was surrounded by nothing but trees and the sound of wind moving through them. It was the kind of silence that didn't feel peaceful. It felt heavy, like the woods were holding their breath. We unloaded the truck. Mark carried a small cooler and a box of beer while I brought in the bags. Inside, the cabin smelled like old wood and damp clothes. There were only 2 rooms, a main area with a small kitchen and a bedroom at the back. The furniture looked decades old, probably from when his father owned the place. The floors creaked under every step. By late afternoon, Mark wanted to go out and chop some firewood. He said it was part of the experience. I followed him outside, and for the next couple of hours, we took turns splitting logs while the sun dropped behind the trees. By the time we were done, my arms ached and sweat had dried cold on my neck. The forest around us had turned dark fast. I remember looking up and realizing how far the night stretched out here. No light, no sound of traffic, not even a distant airplane, just blackness pressing in on every side. After dinner, Mark sat by the fire he built in the stone pit out back. The orange glow flickered across his face as he leaned back in an old camp chair with a beer in hand. I sat across from him, poking at the fire with a stick, watching the embers rise and disappear into the dark. Every now and then, I thought I heard something like snapping branches or slow crunching footsteps in the distance, but I told myself it was just animals. The woods were full of them. Later, around midnight, I decided to head inside. The temperature had dropped sharply, and even the fire couldn't keep it back. Mark said he'd stay out a little longer. I left the door unlocked for him, lit one of the lanterns inside, and crawled into the old bed in the corner of the main room. The mattress smelled musty, and the springs poked through the fabric, but I was too tired to care. Sometime later, I woke up to a sound. It was faint but sharp metal against wood. I stayed still, trying to make sense of it. Then I heard it again. A slow, dragging noise, like something being pulled across the porch. I thought maybe Mark had dropped one of the firewood logs and was dragging it inside. I waited, but he didn't come through the door. The dragging stopped, and for a few seconds, Everything was silent again except the ticking of the lantern's glass. Then there was a heavy thud, followed by the sound of boots on the porch. I sat up, staring toward the door. The lantern flickered slightly. The door didn't open. I waited for a knock, or for him to call out, but nothing happened. Just quiet. I finally got out of bed, grabbed my flashlight, and went to the window beside the door. The flashlight beam caught part of the porch, but there was no one there. The axe we'd used earlier was still leaning against the wall where we left it. I called out for Mark, but my voice sounded swallowed by the trees. No answer. I put on my boots and stepped outside. The cold hit me immediately, sharp and still. The fire pit was out, only a few faint wisps of smoke rising from the ashes. I looked around, sweeping the flashlight through the dark. The beam caught the outlines of trees, the glint of wet leaves, and then, just barely, the tracks in the mud. They were boot prints, deep and messy, heading away from the porch toward the tree line. I followed them, moving slowly, my breath fogging in front of me. The farther I went, the more uneasy I felt. The forest was silent, too silent. Even the usual chirping and rustling sounds were gone. After maybe 30 yards, the prints stopped. The ground beyond that point was hard and covered with dead leaves. I stood there for a while, my flashlight moving in slow circles, trying to see if there was anything else. But there was nothing. I turned back toward the cabin, and that's when I noticed something near the shed. The flashlight caught a faint reflection, like metal glinting. I walked closer. The shed door was half open, swinging slightly in the wind. Inside, there was an old generator, some rusty tools, and a few bags of gravel. On the ground, near the door, was Mark's thermos, lying on its side in the dirt. I picked it up. It was still warm. I felt a sudden chill run through me that had nothing to do with the cold. I backed away from the shed and hurried back toward the cabin, scanning the trees as I went. Every shadow looked like it was moving. Every sound felt closer than it was. By the time I got back inside, my hands were shaking. I locked the door, bolted the windows, and sat near the lantern with my back to the wall. The silence was unbearable. Every creak of the cabin made me jump. I stayed that way until dawn. When the first light came through the trees, I went back outside. The air was damp, and fog clung to the ground. I checked the area again, the porch, the shed, the woods, but Mark was gone. No new footprints, no signs of a struggle, just that single line of boot prints ending in the trees. By noon, I packed up my bag and started walking down the dirt road until I got a signal on my phone. I called for help. A few hours later, 2 sheriff's trucks met me near the edge of the forest. They searched the woods for days. They found his truck, his gear, even his wallet near the cabin, but no trace of him. Weeks later, the search was called off. They said maybe he wandered off drunk and got lost. Maybe he fell into a ravine or the river miles away. But I'd seen those prints. They didn't wander. They stopped clean, as if he'd just vanished mid-step. I never went back to that cabin again. I quit the job a month later, moved to another city, and tried to forget the whole thing. But sometimes, even now, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I still hear that dragging sound in my head, the slow scrape of something heavy across old wood, and I wonder if it ever really stopped. It was early November, cold enough that the air burned when I breathed. The kind of cold that got into your hands no matter how deep you shoved them in your pockets. I had been driving through northern Minnesota for almost 6 hours that day, just moving, no plan. The idea was to get away from everything: work, noise, people. I found an old gravel road off the highway that barely looked used. It wound through miles of bare trees and open fields. I didn't have service, but I didn't care. I just wanted quiet. After driving for what felt like forever, I spotted something in the distance. a small wooden cabin half hidden behind a few crooked pine trees. The road curved toward it and then kept going toward a hill, where I noticed an old graveyard fenced in by rusted iron bars. The cabin looked abandoned, but it was still standing straight, roof intact, door in place. I parked my car off to the side, the tires crunching against the frozen dirt, and stepped out. The silence was heavy, broken only by wind moving through dry branches. The cabin door wasn't locked. It opened with a slow creak. Inside, it smelled like dust, old wood, and something faintly metallic, maybe rust. There was a single cot pushed against one wall, a small stove, and a table with two broken chairs. Everything had a thin coat of dust, like it hadn't been touched in years. I decided I'd stay there for the night. I had a sleeping bag, a flashlight, and a bit of food in my car. The place was good enough to keep me out of the wind. As the sun went down, the whole area turned gray and flat. The sky had no color, just that pale, winter kind of light that fades too early. I walked a little toward the graveyard before dark. The ground was uneven and frozen, covered in patches of old, dead grass. The headstones were tilted, some half-buried. Most of the writing had faded, but a few names were still visible, people from the 1800s mostly. One grave near the fence had a newer-looking cross made of wood. The dirt around it was still a little raised. Felt strange. I don't know why, but it felt wrong, like I was standing somewhere I shouldn't. Maybe it was just how quiet it was, no birds, no sound from the wind except through the trees. I walked back to the cabin before it got completely dark. I started a small fire in the stove with some dry wood I found stacked behind the cabin. The flames gave off a dull orange light, just enough to warm the air a bit. I spread my sleeping bag out on the cot and sat on the floor beside the fire for a while. My flashlight lay beside me, its beam cutting through the shadows on the far wall. The cabin creaked occasionally, soft and slow, like it was breathing. I didn't sleep right away. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening. Every small sound made me tense. The crack of wood in the fire, a gust hitting the window, the faint groan of old nails in the beams. After a while, I must have drifted off because I woke up again to total darkness. The fire had burned down to red embers. It was quiet again, except for something faint outside. It was hard to tell at first if it was real or just the wind, but it didn't sound like wind. It was a steady rhythm, soft, irregular thuds, like someone walking slowly through the dirt. I froze, holding my breath. The sound stopped for a few seconds, then started again, closer. I reached for my flashlight and turned it on, the beam cutting across the room. The window was small, fogged from the cold air outside. I stood up quietly and went closer to it. I couldn't see anything beyond the glass, just shapes of trees and the faint outline of the fence near the graveyard. Then I heard it again. This time it came from the side of the cabin, near the wall. Something scraped lightly against the wood. It wasn't loud, but it was deliberate. I stayed still, holding the light in my hand, waiting. The scraping stopped. For maybe a minute, there was nothing. Then a quick, hollow thump, like something hitting the door gently. I thought maybe it was an animal. There were plenty of them out here, deer, maybe a bear. But the sound wasn't like that. It wasn't heavy enough. It sounded careful. I didn't open the door. I sat back down near the fire, flashlight in one hand, a small knife from my backpack in the other. I stayed like that for a long time, staring at the door. Eventually, everything went silent again. The cold crept back into the room, and my eyes grew heavy. I fell asleep sometime before morning. When I woke up, it was light out. The sun was low, pale through the fog. The ground outside glittered with frost. I opened the door slowly, stepping onto the frozen dirt. There were footprints, small, narrow ones, leading from the side of the cabin toward the graveyard. They weren't mine. They looked like they'd been made by boots, not animal tracks. I followed them a little way, just far enough to see they stopped right at that newer grave with the wooden cross. The dirt there was disturbed, not like it had been dug up completely, but like someone had been kneeling there, pushing the soil around. I went back inside and packed my things. I didn't want to stay another night. Something about that grave, about those tracks, didn't sit right. I could still picture the sound from last night, that slow, heavy movement outside the door. I checked my car before leaving. Everything was fine. No damage, no sign anyone had touched it. The road back to the highway felt longer this time. The trees on either side looked darker, the air thicker somehow. When I reached the main road, I stopped at a gas station about an hour later. The clerk was an older man with gray hair and deep lines around his eyes. When I mentioned the old road with the cabin, he looked up from the counter. He said there used to be a family that lived out there decades ago, back when that land was still worked by farmers. The graveyard, he told me, belonged to them. The last man buried there was a caretaker who stayed long after the family left. People said he lived alone in that same cabin until the mid-90s, when he disappeared during a storm. They found his tools by the fence, but not him. I didn't say much after that. I just nodded and left. Even now, I can still picture that place. The crooked headstones, the frost-covered ground, the wooden cross standing newer than everything else. Sometimes I think about those footprints. I don't know if they were from someone passing through or something else entirely, but I know they weren't mine. I remember the sound outside the wall, the scrape against the wood, the slow steps that stopped just before the door. I haven't gone back since. I don't think I could find it again even if I wanted to. Maybe that road isn't even there anymore. But every so often, on cold nights when the wind hits my house just right, I hear that same slow sound. The faint rhythm of steps through frozen dirt, steady and careful, moving closer. And no matter how many years pass, that sound still makes me feel like I'm back in that cabin, waiting for whatever was outside to finally open the door. It was 2016 when I first came to the Amazon rainforest. I was 29 then, working on a field documentation project that required staying deep inside the forest for weeks at a time. I wasn't a tourist or an adventurer. It was just work. I had agreed to stay in a small wooden cabin near a river, around a 2-hour boat ride from the nearest small village called Itapiranga. The cabin was originally built by a research group years ago, but they'd stopped using it because of flooding and isolation. It was still standing, though weathered, leaning slightly to one side like it had grown tired over the years. I arrived during the rainy season. The air was heavy, always damp. Everything smelled of wet leaves and soil that never seemed to dry. The mosquitoes were relentless, and I could hear insects whining constantly, even at night. The cabin sat on a patch of raised dirt surrounded by tall trees, and from the porch, I could see the brown, slow-moving river twisting through the forest. My only link to the outside world was a small satellite radio, which I used every few days to check in. During the first few days, nothing unusual happened. I spent my time gathering samples, taking photos, and writing notes. The forest was alive in every direction. Monkeys in the trees, birds screaming across the canopy, frogs calling from the water. But at night, it changed. The noise of animals faded into something deeper and harder to explain. The silence wasn't peaceful. It felt like the forest was holding its breath. On the 5th night, I woke up around midnight to a strange sound outside. It was steady, rhythmic, like something dragging along the ground. It wasn't close at first, just faint scraping mixed with the constant chirping of insects. I thought maybe it was an animal, maybe a tapir or some large rodent. I didn't move, I just listened. The dragging sound stopped for a while, then started again, closer this time. It came from behind the cabin, where the ground sloped down toward the river. I stayed awake until it faded away completely. The next morning, I went outside to check. Behind the cabin, the dirt was soft and dark. I saw a long mark in the mud, a kind of groove leading from the tree line to the edge of the clearing. It looked like something had been pulled through the mud, or someone had dragged something heavy. The marks went both directions. I followed them only a few steps before stopping. The forest floor was too dense ahead, and my nerves got the better of me. That afternoon, I tried to focus on my work, but I kept thinking about that sound. When it started raining again, I went inside early. The rain drummed on the tin roof for hours. When it finally slowed, I decided to step out onto the porch for air. The smell of wet earth was strong, and everything glistened under the weak light from my flashlight. Then I saw something that froze me completely. The same dragging marks were back, but this time they were fresh. They ran across the yard, right up to the steps of the porch, then turned back toward the trees. The mud was still wet, shiny, and disturbed like it had happened only minutes earlier. I stood there, staring at the marks, listening. I could hear nothing except the faint hiss of insects. My throat felt dry even though the air was thick with moisture. I went back inside and bolted the door. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing faint sounds outside. Cracks, rustles, light thuds. But I forced myself not to move, not to even breathe loudly. I stayed under the thin sheet until morning, counting the seconds, waiting for daylight. The next few days were worse. Every morning I found new signs. Small prints in the mud near the cabin, disturbed soil, pieces of bark stripped from the trees. It looked deliberate, not random like animal movement. I couldn't figure it out. The feeling of being watched became constant. Even during the day, I'd feel something behind me when I walked into the forest. Once, while I was collecting samples near the river, I thought I saw movement between the trees. Not fast, not clear, just a dark shape that shifted and then disappeared. On the 9th day, I made up my mind to leave early. The thought of spending another night there made my stomach twist. But the weather turned again, and the river rose too much for safe travel. I had no choice but to wait it out. That night, the air felt different. Still heavy, tense. The forest was quiet, quieter than I'd ever heard it. Around midnight, the dragging sound came back, closer than before. It wasn't behind the cabin this time. It was on the porch. I heard wood creak under weight. Then it stopped. I was sitting on the floor by my bed, holding a flashlight, but I didn't turn it on. The silence stretched for what felt like hours. Then a slow scraping sound moved along the outside wall, right by where my head was resting against the boards. The noise slid across the wood, soft but deliberate, like something brushing a stick or knife along the surface. My pulse hammered so hard I thought I'd pass out. Then, after what felt like forever, the sound faded toward the river again. When morning came, I forced myself to open the door. I expected to see tracks again, and I did. But this time, I found something else too. In the mud at the bottom of the porch steps, I saw deep indentations, not like footprints, but more like the corners of a wooden crate or box that had been dragged across the yard. There were small bits of rope fibers tangled in the wet dirt. Whatever it was, it looked like someone had been pulling something heavy toward the trees again. I followed the trail, this time going farther than before. The path wound between thick roots and ferns, down toward the water. When I reached the riverbank, I saw it. A large, half-buried metal drum lying on its side, rusted but sealed with a tight lid. The drag marks led right to it. I stood there staring at it, realizing that whatever had been moved night after night was this. Someone had been dragging it, maybe trying to hide it or move it somewhere else. The drum was too heavy to lift, but there was a small puncture near the rim. Inside, I could smell something foul, chemical, and rotten at the same time. It hit me in the face, and I stumbled back, gagging. My first thought was that it could be industrial waste or something dumped illegally. But there was something else about it. The smell wasn't just chemical. It had a sour, decayed edge that made my stomach turn. I didn't touch it again. I ran back to the cabin, grabbed my pack, and by noon I was gone. The river was high and rough, but I didn't care. I steered the small boat until I reached the village by evening, soaked and shaking. I didn't stop to explain much. I just told them I had to leave. A week later, when I was back in Manaus, I told a local contact about the drum. He said he'd send someone to check it out. Months passed before I heard anything else. Then one day an email came through. They'd found the drum, or what was left of it. It had burst open in the rain. Inside were bones, clothes, and what looked like remains wrapped in plastic and tape. Whoever had been dragging that thing around the cabin wasn't an animal. It was a person. They never found out who it was or where the body came from. No signs of anyone else in the area, no tools, no camps. Just the old cabin, still standing by the river, quiet and half-rotted, like it had been waiting for someone to notice. Even now, I sometimes wake up at night thinking about that scraping sound. Slow, heavy, dragging through the mud. I can still picture the marks outside the porch, the wet dirt, the half-open forest waiting just beyond the light. I tell myself it's over, that it was just something I stumbled into by accident, but deep down I know that whoever or whatever was moving that drum had been doing it long before I got there. And maybe on nights when the rain comes hard, they're still out there by the river, pulling something else through the mud.